All right, so ready to explore some uncharted territory today.
Always up for an adventure.
Well, this deep dive is all about boundaries.
Ah, yes. Those invisible lines we all struggle with.
Exactly. We're taking a plunge into boundaries. When to say yes, how to say no to take control of your life.
That's Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend, right?
You got it.
Yeah.
Ever feel that twinge of guilt when you even think about saying no?
Oh, tell me about it. Especially with family or close friends. It's tough.
You're not alone. This book unpacks why boundaries are the bedrock of healthy relationships.
And trust me, it's packed with real-life examples. Anyone listening can probably relate.
It's like they're handing us a map to those invisible property lines of our lives.
Because sometimes those lines get really blurry, you know?
Yeah, like in Robert's case. The guy practically drowning in debt because he can't say no to his wife's spending habits.
Or Steve, the boss who treats his assistant like an extension of himself.
No separation between work and personal life whatsoever.
Exactly. And that's where the book gets interesting. It breaks down these boundary problems into different types.
So we can finally diagnose ourselves, huh?
Well, not quite a diagnosis, but it helps us understand the patterns.
Like Robert, he's a classic compliant. Fears conflict, avoids rejection, ends up losing himself.
It's like he's trying to disappear, blend in so much he becomes invisible.
I think many people can relate to that, especially if you grew up in a home where your needs were met with anger.
Bingo.
Huh?
And the book connects the dots between childhood and those adult struggles.
Fascinating. So, our inability to set boundaries today might stem from how we were raised.
Precisely. They delve into crucial developmental stages like hatching.
Hatching. Sounds intriguing.
It's where a child first asserts their individuality, their will.
Oh, I see. And if that's constantly shut down.
Or if there are no limits set. Well, those boundary building skills never really form.
Like a muscle that never gets exercised.
Exactly. And, it's not just about parents either. Trauma can play a huge role.
Oh, absolutely. Like in Jerry's case, his fear of anger stemming from an abusive mother.
That foundation of safety is shattered. It makes trusting yourself incredibly hard.
You're constantly in survival mode, avoiding any potential conflict.
Right. So the big question is, how do we break free?
That's where the book shines. It emphasizes the power of that two-letter word.
No. It's about recognizing your right to define yourself, communicate your limits.
And protect your well-being, right?
Absolutely. But it's not just about saying the word, it's about backing it up with action.
You gotta walk the walk.
They provide a whole toolbox for setting boundaries. Words, truth, emotional distance, even relying on support networks.
Like building a fortress around your heart.
You could say that, protecting what's precious to you.
But isn't setting boundaries selfish? Like, are we supposed to shut everyone out?
That's a common myth, and they debunk it beautifully.
So how do they differentiate between healthy boundaries and plain old selfishness?
They distinguish between selfishness, which is all about you, and stewardship.
Stewardship of ourselves.
Exactly. Taking responsibility for your well-being so you can actually show up for others.
Not becoming an island, but creating space to be a better friend, partner, parent, you name it.
Right. And then there's the myth that boundaries equal disobedience, especially in families.
Oh, especially if you were raised in a culture where obedience is everything.
They argue that true obedience should come from a genuine, joyful place, not fear or obligation.
Makes sense. So a lack of boundaries actually leads to resentment, which hurts everyone in the long run.
It's like a boomerang. Try to keep everyone happy by saying yes constantly, and it backfires.
And then there's the fear that boundaries will inevitably hurt others.
They address that head on. They talk about protecting your own treasures without attacking anyone else.
It's like setting a limit might cause someone discomfort, but it doesn't mean you're intentionally inflicting pain.
Right, and they debunk the myth that boundaries are permanent, set in stone.
Oh, good. So we have permission to adjust them as we grow and relationships change.
Absolutely. What works in one season of life might not work in another.
That takes the pressure off. And lastly, they tackle the myth that boundaries equal anger.
They explain that boundaries actually help manage difficult emotions, like anger.
It's about communicating needs constructively, not letting resentment simmer.
Exactly. So we've explored the why of boundaries, but how do we actually apply this wisdom?
Right. How do we translate this into real life? In our marriages, our work, our personal lives?
Well, that's where the book gets even more practical.
Stay tuned, folks. We'll dive into those nitty-gritty details in the next segment.
We'll explore real-life examples and see how these principles play out in different areas of life.
It's going to get even more interesting.
Absolutely. Sometimes the best way to understand something is to see it in action.
Right, like actually witness how these boundary issues play out in real life.
And luckily, this book doesn't shy away from the messy details.
It gets real. Let's go back to Robert and Nancy. Remember, he was struggling with her spending.
Totally. Couldn't say no to those extravagant purchases.
And the book digs deeper, revealing how his childhood shaped his approach to boundaries.
Oh yeah, his story is a classic example of how difficult experiences can impact us.
So what happened to Robert?
Well, growing up, anytime he disagreed or said no, he was met with anger, even punishment.
Ouch, that's tough.
He learned to suppress his needs just to avoid conflict, and sadly, it carried over into his marriage.
It's heartbreaking how those early patterns can linger.
It makes sense, though. If you never learned that disagreement doesn't equal rejection.
You end up constantly trying to please, afraid of losing love.
Right, and that fear can be paralyzing. But the book doesn't leave Robert hanging.
They offer him a way out.
Absolutely. They walk him through setting boundaries, but they emphasize small steps.
So no overnight transformations?
Nope. It's about building that no muscle gradually, starting with low-stakes situations.
Like choosing a restaurant or a movie.
Exactly. And as he gains confidence, he can tackle the bigger issues.
Like confronting his wife about her spending.
Right, but not from a place of blame, but self-ownership.
Owning his own financial well-being, not trying to control hers.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is, by setting those boundaries, he actually empowers Nancy.
Wait, how does that work?
She's forced to face her own issues. It creates this ripple effect.
Wow, so boundaries aren't just about protecting yourself, they can benefit everyone involved.
Exactly. They create space for growth and accountability individually and in the relationship.
That's a powerful insight. And they have another great example, Regina and her husband Lee.
Oh yeah, this one highlights a different kind of boundary challenge: addiction.
Oh wow, that adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Lee was struggling with alcoholism, and Regina spent years trying to control his drinking.
It's that classic pattern of trying to fix someone else while neglecting your own needs.
And it was taking a toll on her, emotionally and mentally.
You can't pour from an empty cup.
Through therapy, she learns to detach from his choices and focus on herself.
So she had to accept that she couldn't change him.
Right, but she could change how she responded. It's about protecting herself and her kids.
That must have been such an empowering realization for her.
It was. She sets firm limits on what she'll tolerate, even creating physical distance if needed.
It's about guarding the good, right? You can love someone without enabling their destructive behavior.
Exactly. And sometimes that's the most loving thing you can do.
Tough love, huh? But it often leads to real change.
It's not about rescuing, but letting someone face the natural consequences.
We've talked a lot about boundaries in relationships, but what about internal boundaries?
Oh, those are just as crucial. The limits we set with ourselves.
Those can be even tougher.
The book breaks it down into 7 areas where we struggle with self-control.
Eating, money, time, those kinds of things.
Yep, those are some big ones. They call them out-of-control soul appetites.
Out-of-control soul appetites. What an evocative phrase.
It's like we have these internal stop signs, but our impulses blow right past them.
And those impulses can lead to all sorts of trouble.
Absolutely. But they offer strategies for setting internal limits, planning, accountability systems, recognizing triggers.
It's like creating a personalized roadmap for those areas where you tend to go off course.
Right. And they don't forget about grace. It's okay to mess up, we're human.
It's about getting back on track.
Exactly. And that's where support systems are so valuable.
Having people to cheer you on, hold you accountable.
It makes a world of difference. But what happens when you set a boundary and someone reacts badly?
Oh, like with guilt trips. I dread those.
The book offers some brilliant advice for those situations.
Give me the goods. What's the secret weapon?
Simple but powerful responses like, I'm sorry you feel that way, but this is my decision.
It's about standing firm in your truth, not letting guilt undermine those boundaries.
And with anger, stay calm, don't take it personally, create distance if needed.
You can be compassionate without absorbing their emotional baggage.
They even give an example of a woman who says, I won't be yelled at. I'm going to another room until we can talk calmly.
Wow, that's setting a clear boundary.
And it forces the other person to confront their anger.
So it's not just about protecting yourself, it's about helping them grow, too.
Right. But setting boundaries also brings up internal resistance, fears, and doubts.
Oh yeah, those voices can be so loud.
Am I being selfish? What if they reject me?
It's like a part of us wants to stay stuck in those old patterns.
They encourage us to challenge those thoughts, remind ourselves of our worth.
Lean on support systems, Focus on the long-term benefits.
It's like training your mind to be your ally, not your enemy.
They also talk about the importance of grieving those losses.
Right, letting go of what we can't control, making space for something new.
It's a process, for sure.
They offer steps, naming the fear, finding support, seeking guidance.
And remembering that we're not alone in this.
Absolutely. And they emphasize developing your own gifts and talents.
Oh, that's a good one. Build up that self-worth.
It's about recognizing your own value, not relying on others for validation.
So it's not just about limits. It's about creating a life aligned with our values, our true selves.
That's the heart of it. Taking ownership, honoring our limits, showing up with integrity.
But it's not always smooth sailing, is it?
Yeah.
They talk about forgiveness, especially when boundaries have been violated.
That's a big one. They say true forgiveness is crucial for healthy boundaries.
So it's not about letting people walk all over you.
No, it's about releasing the anger and pain so you can move forward.
Not condoning the actions, but choosing to let go of the burden.
Exactly. They offer insights into the dynamics of forgiveness, like recognizing our own need for grace.
We've all been on both sides of that equation.
And seeing the other person with compassion, even acknowledging our own role.
It's about taking responsibility without taking on the blame.
Right. And they make it clear, forgiveness doesn't mean allowing the hurtful behavior to continue.
So it's about setting those boundaries, protecting yourself from further harm.
They even connect this to our relationship with God.
Oh, wow. How so?
They talk about releasing anger and disappointment toward God to experience His love and grace.
It's like letting go of that need to control, surrendering to something bigger than ourselves.
They remind us that God wants us to have boundaries.
That's surprising. I always thought boundaries were somehow rebellious,
It's about honoring the unique identity He's given us.
not trying to fit into some mold.
Right. They challenge us to ask if our relationship with God is marked by freedom or fear.
Grace or obligation.
That's a powerful question for all of us to ponder.
It really makes you think about what's motivating our choices, doesn't it?
And recognizing that God's love isn't based on our performance.
It's about embracing our authentic selves, flaws and all.
That's the beauty of it. And that freedom can transform our relationships with others.
Because we can set boundaries with confidence, knowing our worth isn't dependent on their approval.
Exactly. It's like this ripple effect of healing and transformation.
It's inspiring, really. And they even have a chapter on how to measure success with boundaries.
It's not just theory. They give us concrete ways to assess our progress.
So what are some of those key indicators? How do we know if we're on the right track?
Well, they talk about increased self-awareness, emotional stability, a deeper sense of peace and joy,
It's not just about limits, but cultivating inner peace.
and celebrating those small victories. Practice self-compassion, keep pressing forward.
It's a journey with bumps along the way,
And successful boundaries often lead to a shift in relationships.
like attracting people who respect our limits instead of those who drain us.
It's like creating a new energetic field that draws in healthy connections.
That's a beautiful image, especially in romantic relationships. No more settling.
Right, we start seeking partners who affirm our worth, support our growth.
Because we recognize that we deserve to be in relationships where we feel safe, loved, respected,
And that's what boundaries are all about. Creating space for healthy, fulfilling connections.
where everyone can thrive and reach their full potential.
Absolutely. They even connect this to our relationship with God.
I'm curious, how do they bridge those two worlds?
Well, they suggest that we can set boundaries with God, just like we do with people.
Wait, what? Does that mean telling God what we will and won't do?
Not exactly. It's more about recognizing our freedom to choose how we engage with our faith.
Oh, I see. So like setting limits on religious activities or expectations.
Right. And even setting boundaries with our own self-judgment in our spiritual lives.
So important. It's about finding that balance.
They encourage us to examine where our faith might be causing more stress than peace.
Where it's bringing more guilt than grace.
And they talk about setting boundaries with our own negative thoughts, that inner critic.
Oh, that inner critic can be brutal. It's like giving ourselves permission to be human.
They offer tips for dealing with it, challenging those thoughts, practicing self-compassion,
Focusing on our strengths instead of our weaknesses.
and remembering that God's love isn't conditional on our performance.
It's about accepting ourselves, flaws and all, knowing we're loved regardless.
That kind of self-acceptance is so freeing.
It gives you the courage to take risks, try new things,
Embrace the journey, knowing it's okay to stumble.
and those stumbles can be powerful teachers, can't they?
Absolutely. They show us where our boundaries are weak, where we need to strengthen those limits.
And practice greater self-care.
Right. They talk about how those experiences can help us develop resilience, empathy.
A deeper understanding of ourselves and others?
It's about embracing the messy, imperfect beauty of being human.
But how do we know if it's actually working? If those boundaries are making a difference?
Well, they say successful boundary setting often leads to less stress and anxiety.
That makes sense. If you're always overextending yourself, it's bound to take a toll.
They also talk about increased energy and motivation.
Like you're finally freeing up that energy to pursue what truly matters.
And improved relationships, not just creating distance, but actually enhancing connections.
So boundaries can actually lead to deeper intimacy.
Exactly. Greater respect, deeper connection, more fulfilling interactions.
It's about creating that space for authenticity and vulnerability.
They also talk about increased self-worth and self-respect.
Like you finally start to value yourself when you honor your own limits.
And that self-worth can impact every area of your life.
Your career, relationships, overall well-being.
They even talk about a greater sense of purpose and fulfillment.
It's like you're finally aligned with your values, your authentic self.
And that can be incredibly motivating.
It fuels your creativity, your passion, your desire to make a difference.
And ultimately, a greater sense of peace and joy.
It's like you can finally relax, embrace the present moment.
Those moments are a testament to the power of boundaries.
It's a reward for all the hard work and courage it takes.
And remember, it's not about perfection, it's about progress.
There will be stumbles along the way.
They encourage us to celebrate our successes, remind ourselves of the bigger picture.
It's a journey, but it's a journey worth taking.
Absolutely. But what about when you're facing a really tough situation?
Like a toxic family member or a difficult breakup.
They have a whole chapter on boundaries in difficult relationships.
So they don't shy away from the hard stuff.
Not at all. They offer strategies for setting limits with those who are resistant or manipulative.
It's about protecting yourself, creating a safe space.
And sometimes that means creating distance, limiting contact, or even ending the relationship.
It's about prioritizing your own well-being.
They emphasize that you don't have to go through this alone.
Reach out for support. Build that network of people who understand.
And don't forget self-care.
It's not selfish, it's essential. What are some of their self-care suggestions?
Exercise, meditation, nature, journaling, creative activities.
It's about nourishing your soul.
And remembering that setting boundaries is an ongoing process.
It's not a one-time fix.
It's a journey of self-discovery, self-love, and self-empowerment.
Constantly checking in with yourself,
Yeah.
adjusting those boundaries as you grow.
And embrace the journey.
And they even have a section on boundaries in the digital age.
Oh yeah, that's crucial these days. Social media, constant demands.
They can be overwhelming.
They encourage us to set limits on screen time, curate our online feeds.
Be mindful of the energy we're consuming and projecting.
It's about creating balance and intentionality, even in our online lives.
It's like setting boundaries with the internet itself.
You could say that. And they remind us that we have the power to choose.
We're not at the mercy of technology.
We can use it intentionally to enhance our lives, not drain us.
And they offer tips for setting those digital boundaries.
Like scheduling tech-free time, turning off notifications.
Being mindful of the content we consume and create.
It's about reclaiming our time and attention and using them wisely.
So it's not just about boundaries with people. It's about boundaries with everything that demands our energy.
Exactly. It's about creating a life that's truly aligned with our values, our priorities.
And protecting our well-being in all areas.
It's about taking back control and living intentionally.
Living a life that's authentic and fulfilling.
And that's what boundaries ultimately give us. The freedom to be ourselves, to love well, and to live a life that matters. You know, as we've been talking about all this, I've been struck by something.
What's that?
This idea that boundaries can actually help us love better.
That does seem a bit counterintuitive at first glance.
It's like, how can setting limits make us more loving?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
Well, think about it. When we're constantly overextending ourselves, neglecting our own needs.
We end up depleted, resentful.
Exactly. There's nothing left to give. It becomes this transactional kind of love.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like, I did this for you, so you owe me.
Right. It's not genuine generosity, it's obligation.
Have you ever felt that in your own life? I know I have.
Absolutely. And the book really highlights the difference between that and true love.
So what's the difference, according to Cloud and Townsend?
They say true love is freely given, no strings attached.
It's a yes from the heart, not a yes out of pressure.
Exactly. And to get to that place, we need to create space for ourselves.
We need those boundaries.
Right. So we can actually show up for others with genuine generosity.
Makes sense. They also talk about how boundaries can enhance intimacy. which is kind of surprising.
How can limits lead to more intimacy? I know, it seems paradoxical.
But I'm curious to hear their explanation.
Well, they say that when we have clear boundaries, we can be more vulnerable.
More authentic with each other.
Exactly. No more hiding behind masks or pretending to be someone we're not.
Because we're not afraid of being judged or rejected.
Right. And that openness, that honesty is what builds deep connection.
It's like those boundaries create a safe space for our hearts to meet.
Without fear of getting hurt.
I love that.
Yeah.
But I'm still stuck on this idea that boundaries make us more attractive.
Okay, think about it this way. Are you more drawn to someone who's needy and clingy?
Definitely not. It's a turnoff.
Or someone who's confident, self-assured?
That's much more appealing.
And that confidence often stems from having healthy boundaries.
It's like they know their worth, they know their limits, and they're not afraid to show it.
And that's magnetic. It's not about trying to impress, it's about being authentically you.
And that authenticity is a sign of maturity, emotional stability.
People are drawn to that.
Especially in romantic relationships, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. They say with healthy boundaries, we're less likely to settle.
Less likely to end up with partners who are emotionally unavailable, manipulative.
Right. We attract those who are also emotionally healthy, capable of reciprocating love and respect.
Because we recognize that we deserve to be in those kinds of relationships.
And that starts with valuing ourselves enough to set those boundaries.
It's a self-loving act, not a selfish one.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question.
All right, hit me with it.
If you could change one boundary in your life today, what would it be?
And what difference would it make? That's a powerful question for everyone listening. It's been an incredible journey exploring this topic.
It really has. And remember, establishing boundaries is a process.
Start small, be kind to yourself, and seek support when you need it.
You've got this.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of boundaries. It's been a real eye-opener.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, remember to guard your heart, honor your limits, and live a life that's true to yourself.